Empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men, shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men to live extraordinary lives. Shatter the stereotypes. Shatter the stereotypes. Power Black men to live extraordinary lives.
Welcome to Shatter the Stereotypes, where the intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. This show is based on the simple idea that every Black man is capable of creating inner peace, dynamic health, great relationships, and financial abundance. Therefore, we provide insights and strategies to educate, motivate, and inspire Black men to reach their full potential and create the life of their dreams. So if you're ready for some high-octane motivation and inspiration that supports and empowers you to live the life you were born to live, get ready to shatter the stereotypes so you can build a life that lights you up and positively impacts the world. So now, let's shatter the stereotypes with your host, Coach Michael Taylor.
Hello and welcome to Shatter the Stereotypes, where my intention is to empower Black men to live extraordinary lives. You see, there's never been a shortage of Black male role models. There's only been a lack of exposure of those role models in mainstream media. So my intention is to showcase and highlight Black men who are doing remarkable things in the world. And as a man who happens to be Black, I am extremely optimistic about the future for Black men. I do not accept the negative media narrative that Black men are somehow endangered. I believe the future is filled with infinite possibilities for Black men, and I'm committed to empowering them to embrace these possibilities. One of the many challenges we face as Black men, in addition to all the negative media-generated stereotypes, is answering the question, what is Blackness? How do we define it? What constitutes Blackness? Is it based on our skin color, the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the music we listen to, our ancestral bloodline? What exactly does it mean to be Black? My guest today is John Blake, and he is an award-winning journalist and the author of a new book titled, More Than I Imagined: What a Black Man Discovered About the White Mother He Never Knew. It is an insightful look at the challenges of being biracial and dealing with racism and self-identity. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I'm excited to have him on the podcast. So without further ado, let me welcome John to the podcast. Hello, John. How are you?
All right. Thank you for having me.
All righty, man. Really looking forward to our conversation. So let me begin by saying thank you for joining me on the podcast. And you're definitely one of the reasons I launched this show, because I've always known there are an infinite amount of Black male success stories out there. So I wanted to create a space for us to share those stories. I also want to create a space for Black men to come together to have deep, heartfelt conversations that we generally don't have, not even in barbershops. So once again, I say thank you for shattering the stereotypes of what it means to be a Black man in America, and for giving me more reasons to be optimistic as a man who happens to be Black. And your book definitely filled me with optimism. So
Thank you.
Before we jump into your work and your book, let's start off with a few icebreaker questions. So first of all, tell us where you're from.
I'm from West Baltimore, a pretty well-known neighborhood. It was the setting for the HBO series The Wire, and it was also the epicenter for the 2015 protest that erupted after a Black man named Freddie Gray died in police custody, and former President Trump tweeted about it. So it's this infamous all-Black inner-city neighborhood that's become this symbol of Black anger and rage. But that's where I'm from.
Got it. Now, name a woman who's inspired you to be who you are.
That's an easy question, and it's the person I write a lot about in my book, my Aunt Sylvia. She was my father's sister, and she played a huge part. She was my surrogate mom growing up, and she got me involved in reading books and was always there for me.
Nice. Now, name a man you look up to and admire.
My father, because I thought he was very brave in a lot of different ways. And also because despite, experiencing a tremendous amount of racism growing up in the Jim Crow era, being born in the Depression. I never saw him use racial slurs against white people. And I never saw him really pessimistic. He was a very optimistic person who believed in the future of this country.
Okay. So let's say you're going to be trapped on an island for 30 days and you can only take one book with you. What book would you take?
Well, probably the Bible, because I'm going to need as much hope as I can get if I'm trapped on a desert island. Yeah.
Let's see here. Now, what does John Blake like to do for fun?
Right now, fun for me would be I love to read, love to play tennis, and love to travel, love movies, plays. I guess things that you would consider the arts. I like that.
Gotcha. Now, if I pulled up your playlist on your phone or your media player, who are some of the artists I might hear?
Well, you would hear what we call like West Coast traditional jazz. You would hear people like Paul Desmond, Gary Mulligan, but you would also hear like the old torch singers like Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra. And then finally, you would hear a lot of 70s funk like Earth, Wind and Fire, Commodores, people like that.
Got it. Now, I wrote a book titled The Cure for Onlyness, a Black Man's Guide to Joy, Passion, and Purpose. And the book addresses the feeling of onlyness we as Black men sometimes experience when we are in environments where we're the only people of color. So I'm curious, number one, I'm sure you've been in that situation. And do you find it difficult to navigate through those types of situations?
Well, my situation, yes, I have been in that situation. If, working in corporate America, I've been a journalist for like 30 plus years. And particularly when I first started, when I would look around the newsroom, I would hardly see anyone that looked like me. So that was difficult. Now things are a lot better in newsrooms, but it's still a long way to go. But yes, I've been in that situation. And what I found to help me navigate it is one is to try to be really good at what I do, to just invest in my craft, and also secondly, to find support from either friends or mentors that could help me through it.
Got it. Now, as a man who happens to be Black, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future in general?
Well, I'm optimistic, and I would say more than anything, I'm hopeful.
Okay.
I've talked to a lot of people who say that sometimes it's a difference between hope and optimism. Some people will say optimism is just you think things are going to get better, but you don't really know and you don't really do anything about it. Hope, though, is you not only think things will get better and can be better, but you invest in it with your energy and your action. And I'm very hopeful. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I feel like a lot of the stories that we write about race now and our racial divisions in our country, they're not stories about hope. I feel like there's this pessimism that's settled over the country, that so many people believe that racism is a permanent part of being American, that it's embedded in white people, it can't change, that the country will always have this problem where we can't get past our racial divisions. And I don't think enough people are telling stories that say, yes, we can get past that. And so I'm a huge believer in hope. And that's one of the things I try to convey in my memoir.
And I love that. And it's interesting because I like to think of myself as an irrepressible optimist, because although I recognize all the challenges facing our world today, I am extremely optimistic and hopeful, as you mentioned. And that was one of the reasons why I launched this show, because I think one of the ways to shift the consciousness, to shift the narrative, is for us to have these types of conversations. So with that being said, now I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce John Blake, the professional, to the audience. So tell us who you are and what you do.
I'm a journalist at CNN. I've been at CNN, and I specifically write for CNN.com, which is the online news site. and I've been writing about race, religion, and politics for a long time, not only at CNN, but before that. And I'm also the author of a book called More Than I Imagined: What a Black Man Discovered About the White Mother He Never Knew. Yeah.
So when did you decide you wanted to be a journalist?
Probably in high school, probably around the ninth and 10th grade. So I'm from Baltimore. In Baltimore, when I was coming up, was a big newspaper town. We had about really three big newspapers. And so I would see newspapers in my father's house on a coffee table everywhere, newspapers and magazines, and everybody read them. And I thought, wow, that would be such a cool job to have, become a journalist and become a storyteller. So it was really around high school.
Hmm. So let's begin with your first job as a reporter in Los Angeles. Tell us about that experience.
Well, that was very difficult because my first job was working in a suburb of Los Angeles called the San Fernando Valley. It was virtually all white, my work setting, and it was a very conservative area. And so one of the things I remember about it is that I could see how there wasn't overt racism in the newsroom. Nobody was using the N-word, but I could see how the decisions that were being made about what we write about were very much influenced by racism. So we had Black and brown communities in that area, but we hardly ever wrote about them except if there was crime. And I vividly remember when a white editor came up to me one night and he said, if there's a shooting and someone is murdered and they're not, and if they're Black or brown, they're not a homeowner, we're not really interested,
Wow.
you know. And I was stunned. So only white homeowners were the ones who were really interested. And I didn't even think, did I hear that right? But that's the kind of work environment my first job was in. It was really difficult.
Wow. So I'm curious though, how did you get into writing about race and religion? Was there something that the editors pushed you towards, or was that just something you wanted to focus on?
Now, it was something that people offered to me. So a lot of times in journalism, if you're Black or a person of color, they assume that you're interested in writing about race. So those are the beats, the responsibilities people asked me to take on. And they also asked me to take on religion. I just happened to have an interest in some of these areas, but it wasn't something where I raised my hand and say, I want to do this.
Ah, got it. So when did you first decide to write this new book?
The germ of the idea began in 2015 when I went back to West Baltimore to cover the racial upheaval that erupted after Freddie Gray, a young Black man, died in police custody. So when I went back there, this is one of the biggest racial upheavals in our country history. My neighborhood was up in flames. Martial law was called. National Guardsmen were patrolling my neighborhood with machine guns. Smoke was going over the skyline, buildings, being burned and looted. And I was going back to my neighborhood and I was like, wow, my neighborhood, my whole world that I grew up in is coming apart because of racism. But yet at the same time, I knew that there were these white family members, this white side of myself that I had no contact with because of racism, but yet we were coming together. And I was struck by that contrast. It was like, maybe I have a story that runs counter to what I'm seeing in my neighborhood. Maybe I have a story about race that's hopeful because I'm seeing myself and these members of my white family change in ways I never expected. And maybe I should tell that story about what happened to me and my mom, and maybe that'll be worth sharing. So that was the germ of the idea. And then around the pandemic, that's when I really started to begin to write it.
Mm. Now, I know from experience that writing a book can be a very therapeutic and healing experience. So, did writing your book have that type of effect on you?
No, I can't say it was therapeutic because the writing process was too grueling for me. I think for
Mm.
me, maybe the therapeutic nature comes like now afterward, where I'm getting a lot of reaction from people who are saying, I really enjoyed your story. It spoke to me. Now I can step back and have more perspective. But the actual writing itself is very exhausting. It's a grind, and
Mm.
it's like chopping wood. It's just really just trying to get through it day by day.
Yeah. So, what were some of the most difficult parts to write about?
I think some of the most difficult parts would be, I think the most difficult parts were, believe it or not, not so much some of the the more painful memories, like how I met my mom for the first time, how I dealt with the racism from my white family members. But I think the most difficult parts were just the parts where I had to be really honest about my own vulnerability, just my own flaws. Um, I think there was a period where I had to write about how growing up in West Baltimore, people, when people come from my neighborhood, people want to hear stories about the violence. And what I wanted, there was a part where I said, but the biggest violence I saw was kind of internal, was spiritual, where there were so many people, so many young Black men who were convinced that they had no future, that they couldn't use their minds, and I was one of them. That was very difficult to admit and to write.
Mm.
But I think the biggest challenge is not so much the pain, but in a memoir is to be really honest and vulnerable.
Yeah. So, what were some of the most enjoyable parts of writing the book?
I really enjoyed writing about uh, I really enjoyed writing about the process of connecting to my white family members. So for some background for people, so when I was born, I didn't know my mother at all. She vanished from my life not long after I was born without explanation. And nobody in my family told me why she disappeared. All they said was, your mother's name is Shirley. She's white, and her family hates Black people. So I grew up in this environment where I knew that this whole other side of me, that they hated me. They wanted nothing to do with me because my father was Black. And then combined with that, I'm in this neighborhood where nobody seems to like white people. So I grew up with all this tremendous hostility toward white people. The most enjoyable parts of the book came when I began to write about how I reconnected and reconciled with these white family members. And what was so enjoyable about it is that they changed me, but I changed them. And people who frankly had a serious problem with racism, people who thought that white and Black people shouldn't be together, people who used the N-word, they were changed by the relationship we were able to develop.
Mm, nice. So, did you learn anything about yourself that you may not have known about yourself before you wrote the book? In other words, were there any light bulb moments for you about yourself as you were writing the book?
I think, yeah, there were a lot. I think one is people told me that when you write a book like this, that you will that you will remember things that you have repressed, that memories will come flooding back that you hadn't thought about in years. And I didn't think that was true, but that was definitely true. There were a lot of experiences that I have forgotten about, and they came flooding back, and I could validate them because I talked to other people who were there with me. So that was one thing that was really stuck with me. And I think other light bulb moments is the big thing is my mom. My perception of her changed radically. I thought she was one person at the beginning of writing the book, but then at the end, and I began to see how incredible she was. This young woman who had two Black sons in the mid 60s when interracial marriage was illegal, who defied her family, who defied her community, and went through so much pain. And I began to really see her strength and what was special about her when I wrote the book, but I didn't see it before then.
Mm. So, your book obviously is about being biracial and your father falling in love with and marrying a white woman. And there's so many. I could speak to you hours about this because I really resonated with the challenges that you faced. Even though I'm not biracial, I know what it's like to be rejected simply because I'm light skinned.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk a little bit about that. So I want to start off first of all, though. Let's talk a little bit about your dad. So let's tell us a little bit about your dad.
So my father was a merchant seaman. So he had a very colorful, adventure-filled life. And a merchant seaman was somebody who just traveled around the world. He started off in World War II, uh, being on the convoys that sailed across the North Atlantic and seeing ships sink sunk by German U-boats. He spent time in Korea during the Korean War. He spent a lot of time in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So he was always in all these hot spots around the globe, and he seemed to thrill in that kind of adventure. He was also somebody who was a rule breaker. And so he was somebody who even at the risk of his life, decided that he was going to seek my mom out in the mid 60s and date her, even though it could have cost her life. And so and he was just he's just a very colorful guy who liked to sing Nat King Cole records, who liked to drink a lot and hit the streets, and just very colorful. And he was also just had a lot of physical courage to do what he did for a living.
Yeah. Now, a lot of us as Black men did not have loving, nurturing, and supportive relationships with our fathers. As a matter of fact, I'll assert that most Black men may have no idea what that really means. And throughout your book, you talk about the estranged relationship you had with your dad. And at the same time, you talk about how much your dad meant to you. And there's a part in the book where you attempted to stay awake to make sure your dad didn't leave, but you fell asleep and he ended up leaving. Can you share that story?
Yeah, so because my father was a merchant seaman, he spent about 8 months out of the year overseas. And so since I didn't grow up with my mom, there was no one, he couldn't find anyone to take care of us. So when I say us, I have a younger brother, Patrick, and he was like a year younger. And so we stayed most of our times in foster homes. So, and I hated staying in those foster homes. They were cruel places. So when my father would come home from the ship, it was like Christmas morning. We could finally spend time with our father. But inevitably, he would have to leave to go back overseas to work. And I hated that because that meant that I would have to go back to these foster homes. I wouldn't see him, I know, for like maybe 6 to 7 months. So what I would try to do, I would beg him like, Dad, don't leave, don't go to work, don't do this, don't go overseas. And I would try to stay up at night so I could prevent him from leaving, because often he would leave like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when we were asleep. And every time I tried to do it, I couldn't stay up. So I would go to bed with him, and then I would wake up and he would be gone. And I knew I wouldn't see him for like 6 or 7 months. And it was just an awful, sad feeling. And I had to go back to those foster homes.
Because that was the part of the book that really sort of broke my heart, because I could relate. Because I remember with my dad, I didn't really have a shall I say, a deep relationship with my father. I didn't meet my father until I was 6. My father had left when I was real young. And again, I met him when I was 6, and I lived with him for about 7 years, and we just never really connected. And as I was reading your story, I could feel that pain, that hurt of wanting to have that relationship with your dad, but not really being able to. But again, that was another part of the book that I really loved. I loved how you shared that love for your dad, and at the same time, that longing to have your father more involved in your life. So I'm curious, so did writing the book change how you viewed your father?
Yeah, it made me realize how extraordinary he was. Writing the book made me realize that it was difficult for him to leave us, and that he tried the best that he could. And more than anything, it made me realize how much he loved my mom. I had doubts about that as a kid. I thought, well, maybe my father didn't really love my mom. Maybe he was only drawn to her because it was a taboo relationship in those days for a Black man to be with a white woman. But as I wrote the book and I began to learn more about how he treated my mom, to see them interact, I began to realize that he really stood by her and that he did really love her. And that was one of the pleasures of writing a book.
Now, one thing I truly admired about your father was his attitude about being Black. And I want to share an excerpt from the book that I think encapsulates his attitude. And you wrote, "One of the reasons my father took a cab to see my mother was that he decided early on that he wasn't going to live in fear of white people like his father had. He was entitled to whatever white men had, including their most prized possessions, their women. But if I even suggested that he had taken a big risk in seeing my mother, he quickly waved away that characterization. I didn't take risk, he told me. I wanted to make sure I got a fair deal, whatever I did. During the 40s and 50s, Black people didn't think of having the same things a white man had. Anything I did, I wanted to make sure it was equal. That's all that was. Now, I think that speaks volumes about your dad. So, what are your thoughts about that little excerpt right there?
Yeah, and I remember talking to him that night and him telling me that. I was taping the conversation, so those are his exact words. And there's a little story to it. So, like I said, he had born. He was born during the Great Depression, grew up in Jim Crow era, and he told me a story about how he had seen his father humiliated by a white man, and it just made him so angry, and he resolved that I'm never going to live that way. And I think one of the things that was key that enabled him to live that way was because of the job he had. Because he spent most of his time overseas, it gave him a different perspective than a lot of Black men of that era. So when you're a Black man going overseas, when you go into places like Vietnam or France or wherever, they treat you as a human being. They treat you as a man. So he was accustomed to being treated that way in the 40s and 50s. And even when he was on a ship, there was a bond between him and a lot of the white sailors that you couldn't really find stateside, because at sea, every man, the color didn't matter. What mattered is, could you depend on that man to save your life if there was a storm or something happened? So what I tell people is that my father was probably, he worked and lived in probably the most integrated space a Black man could live in during the post-World War II era. And that was the deck of a merchant marine ship. So I think that really shaped him also and gave him that courage to live in a sort of fearless way, to say, I want everything that a white man has, because overseas, he had a lot of what a white man had.
Mm, yeah, I was deeply moved by that. I could just get a sense of, I don't know if I'd call it defiance or not, but I just felt that he had this sense about him that
Yeah,
this is who I am.
yeah,
And, he didn't buy into all the things society says a Black man was supposed to be, do, and have. He just said, look, I get to choose what I want to do, what I want to have, how I want to be. And I just was really inspired by that aspect of it. So
thank
with
you.
that being said, you at the beginning obviously mentioned that you had a lot of animosity, anger, if you will, towards white people.
Mm-hmm.
So did his attitude conflict with your feelings for white people?
Yeah. Yeah, because he never, I never heard him use racial slurs to talk about white people, to say the white man is doing this to me, or white this or white that. He seemed to be free of this anger and bitterness toward white people. Now, he experienced racism. I remember he told me one time, he says, I've been called the N-word so many times that I thought it was my middle name. And he didn't use it. He didn't say N-word. And I knew he went through a lot of stuff, but it didn't seem to fill him with this anger that consumed him. And I didn't understand that. But at
Mm,
the same time, he didn't understand my situation, where I'm growing up as what I call a closeted biracial person in West Baltimore. I'm ashamed to have a white mother. I didn't want anybody to know. And he didn't understand why I didn't want people to know that I had a white mother. I would not refer to myself as biracial. I would say I'm Black, and that would anger him. So while I admired his attitudes on race, they were kind of mysterious to me. And I don't think he understood the kind of racial issues that I had to deal with growing up, not knowing anything about my mom's family and being in my neighborhood.
mm. So with that being said, now let's talk about your mom. So throughout the book, you talk about her struggles with mental illness, and you also talk about the shame you initially felt for having a white mother. So can you walk us through the very first time you met your mom?
So I'm 17 years old and I'm about to go to college. And keep in mind that I don't know anything about my mom. There's no picture of her. I don't know the sound of her voice. There's no memory. She's like a ghost. She just vanished from my life. And by that point in my life, I thought, well, she's dead, or she doesn't care about us. And again, I had also not heard anything from her family. So that whole side of myself didn't exist in my mind. And then one day my father comes to me and says, do you want to meet your mom? And it was like a bombshell. And 3 days later, I, along with my younger brother Patrick, we are driven out to the countryside in Maryland, where I lived. And we are guided into this really menacing looking red brick building, this huge red brick building. It looks like the set for the Shawshank Redemption. And we don't know what it is because no one's telling us anything. And we're guided into this waiting room. And while we're waiting there, I could hear people moaning in pain in these distant hallways, and other people were just like laughing hysterically. Still didn't quite know where I was. And then a hospital orderly guided a thin white woman into the room. And when she saw us, when she saw me, when she saw my brother Patrick, her eyes lit up. And she came to us, kind of half running, half shuffling, and said, oh boy, John and Pat, it's so good to see you. And she hugged me. And it was my mom. That's my first time meeting her. I didn't know what to do. I had never even used the word mom before. I didn't know, to say that. But what was also really awkward about that meeting is that's when I realized, like, this is where I am. I was in a waiting room of a mental institution. My mom had been confined to this institution for most of my life, and she had a severe form of mental illness called schizophrenia. Now, it would take me years to kind of explain how that stuff impacted me, that type of meeting. But one of the things that really hit me at the beginning is it immediately began to shift my racial attitudes. Before that, I felt like no white person could empathize, could understand what it meant to be Black, to suffer, to be treated with contempt, to be looked down on because of the way where you were born. But when I met my mom and I began to think, wow, she's been living in this hellish place for years, I was like, wow, I've never seen a Black person suffer like that. So all the assumptions I had about white people begin to shift. I mean, she shattered those assumptions within the first 15 minutes, and she didn't even say a word. So for the first time when I met my mom, I began to develop empathy toward white people, and that had never happened before because I had only been angry.
Wow. Now, one of the things I enjoy about listening to audiobooks read by the author is the feelings that come up as the author shares their stories. And as I listened to your audiobook, I could feel in your words the transformation from shame to admiration and pride as you learned about your mom.
Right.
So, what were some of the highlights of your mother's life that caused you to shift from shame to admiration?
And that's an excellent point, and I appreciate you saying that. So when I first met my mom, seeing her in that condition, I only saw her mental illness. I did not recognize that same person that was so defiant and so rebellious that she would defy her family to be with a Black man, that person was still there. It just took me a long time to see it. And so to answer your question, as I began to write the book, I began to talk to people who knew her and could tell me stories about what she was like before she became really ill. And they told me stories of what it was like, how she would come around and see my father, how she would endure all this persecution and criticism from white people, and she would be so defiant. And one of the things that caused me to admire her, and I thought about it this way, my mom did something in the mid-60s that very few white people could do, and that was she saw her common humanity with Black people, and she was willing to pay a price to put those beliefs into action. So I recognized her courage, and that really filled me with admiration. And then I began to think, look at what's happening in today's world. Nobody thinks twice about interracial marriages or biracial kids anymore. And why is that? And then I made the connection. It was because of people like my mom and my dad. In the mid-60s, all these people got together when it was illegal, where a man could get killed, a Black man could get killed. And they said, I'm going to love who I love. All these laws, they don't make sense to me. I don't care what my family says. And that's what they did. And they created this ripple effect where now interracial marriage, biracial children, it's a norm. So she was part of this vanguard of Black, white, and brown people in the mid-60s that created this world we live in today where interracial marriage is normal, biracial children, there's nothing wrong with that. And so I tell people, I am living proof that people who seem like they have no power, that they can change America. They can change America in ways you never expect. Because my mom was part of that. And I never thought of it that way before until I wrote the book.
Now, one of the most heartfelt moments in the book for me was when you went to visit your mom at the daycare center and your dad was there.
Yeah.
And it was one of the few times you actually got to hang out with both your parents at the same time. So can you tell us about that story?
Yeah. So I had never really seen my parents together. And I remember one of the first meetings I had with my parents, my brother was with me and we were talking to him. And I looked over to my younger brother, Patrick, who's only a year younger, and he had this like silly grin on his face. I'm like, what is he? Why does he have this silly grin on his face? What's so funny? And then I realized I had the same silly grin on my face. And it was because we had never seen them together. And we were seeing how the affection, the friendship, the teasing, the love. And so when I went to daycare, that scene, I taped it. And so all that's the dialogue you read, that is verbatim from my tape. And just to see my mom sing and my father joke with her, it's a good feeling for any child to know that their father loves their mom and their mom loved their father, despite what happened to their relationship. It was great to see.
Yeah, yeah, I thought that was amazing. Now, so let's imagine now that your parents are in heaven. They're together and they're looking down on you right now as you're going around talking about this book and sharing their stories. So what do you think they'd be saying to each other?
Well, I can almost tell you what my father would be saying. He would be saying, "I wish we didn't share all our business." He, I remember not long before he passed, he called me up one night. He said, "I heard you thinking about telling some story about growing up." I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'm thinking about writing about, some of the racial issues I experienced." And he got quiet on the phone and he said, "What racial issues? You didn't experience any racial issues." So he was totally clueless, but he told me, "I don't think you should be talking about this stuff." He was a very private man. He didn't, he was the least introspective person I ever met. I mean, he didn't like talking about feelings and thinking about stuff. So I don't think he would particularly like this. But I think my mom, I think she would have been tickled by seeing her picture on the book cover, and I can almost picture her going, "Oh boy, oh boy, oh my Lord," you know. But the thing is, with my parents, like my mom, I never talked with my mom about race. I never talked about what I did for a living. That wasn't important to her, and I really didn't talk about my profession with my father too. So it would have been interesting to see how they would have reacted.
Interesting. So, as mentioned, my dad and I didn't have a great relationship. Actually, we didn't have a relationship. But one thing that I've learned is that, especially as Black men, sometimes we tend to invalidate the need to have relationships with our dads. I know I've heard a lot of Black men in the work that I do in workshops and stuff talk about, well, my dad wasn't around, but that was okay. I came a better man because he wasn't there. I hear all these rationalizations, but the truth is, we all have a father hunger. We want to be loved by our dad. We want our dads to be proud of us. So as you think about your dad now, and even though he may have been a little uncomfortable with you sharing his business, overall, I'm sure he's feeling a sense of pride in what you've not only done with the book, but your work in general. So, did you get that sense from your dad that he was just proud of you?
Yeah, he told me. I did. I was his strangest son for a long time because here was a guy, like I said, who loved to go out and hit the bars at night, loved to drink. He would get in fights in the street. He was a really kind of a rough guy who loved to work with his hands. And he had this bookish, introverted son who liked to read books all the time. And that was kind of weird to him. But as I got older, and he began to see, that I was a journalist and I was my own person, I do remember him taking me aside one day in the kitchen and says, "I'm proud of you."
Mm.
And he used to kind of make fun of me when I was a kid because I like to read books all the time because he thought that was what he would say that's what sissies do and all that kind of stuff. But I remember after he died, I went into his bedroom and I was going through his dresser and I found articles that I had written going way back to college that he had collected, and I didn't know that. So I know he was proud of me. And my father was. I tell people I've met a lot of fascinating people as a journalist. I've interviewed Nelson Mandela. I've met celebrities. I met all the big shots. But my father is one of the most interesting people I've ever known. He's just so fascinating.
Now, do you have kids yourself?
No, I don't.
No kids. Okay. Now, another important person in your life was your mother's sister, your Aunt Mary.
Yeah.
And I was deeply moved by how your relationship with her evolved. So, can you tell us a little bit about your Aunt Mary?
Yeah, that was a pivotal relationship in my book because um, one of the things I've been interested in as someone who writes about race is what causes people to shift their racial attitudes. Like, how do we reduce racial prejudice in people? How do we change people, white people who don't see black and brown people as fellow humans and all? And I've been like, that's something I've been like really drawn to. And my Aunt Mary, my relationship with her showed me how that's done. And so what I mean by that is my Aunt Mary was my villain when I grew up. I heard stories about her, how she really didn't like black people. And I knew that some of these stories were true because she had no contact. She didn't reach out to me. Even after I met my mom, she didn't reach out to me. It wasn't until my mid-20s that I met her. And when we met, we were very polite and she asked to meet me. And we had several conversations. So finally, I asked her one day, why didn't you reach out to me and my brother Patrick when we were younger? Was it because we're black? And she said, no, it wasn't because you were black. It was because you weren't Catholic. I was raised not to associate with Catholic. And I knew she was lying. I knew about the racism in her family. I knew about the racism, her father. I know what he had my father arrested, called him the N-word. So I knew that was part of her. And that made me angrier. So to speed up, to answer your question about Aunt Mary, we had this very tense relationship for a long time because I felt like she was in denial about her racism and she wouldn't apologize. And I remember one day something happened to me where I did something that humbled me. And so what I did, I went back and I began to look at all these letters that Aunt Mary had written me over the years. And when I read those letters, I felt like such a fool because I realized that she had apologized for her racism, that she had changed. And she was just writing these beautiful letters saying I was wrong. I was raised up in this all white world where, we were taught that black and white people should be different and this, and I'm sorry. I hope you can accept my apology. And our relationship changed after that. And so I look back and I'm like, well, how did our relationship change? How did her attitudes shift? And a huge part of it was just a day in and day out part of the relationship. And so what I tell people when I look at my relationship with Aunt Mary, and also what I talk about in the book is that I joined these churches, these interracial communities. I think now that the things that really change people are relationships. Facts don't change people, relationships do. And I think we've forgotten that. And nobody illustrates that more to me than the journey that Aunt Mary has gone on, because now we're really close. And she loves talking about Black Lives Matter. She's very interested in racial justice. She sent me a copy of the Killer Mockingbird book, just a couple of weeks ago. Totally different person than when I met. And what was it? It was our relationship. Not so much a book. Not so much a lecture that I gave her. I didn't teach her about systemic racism, anything. It was just a relationship.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that was I mentioned that your book fills me with optimism and hope. And
It's deliberate.
yeah, and as I read that or listened to you talk about that, I could feel the transformation.
Yeah.
The anger and separation from this person to this loving embrace of my family. This person is a part of my family, and I could feel authentically that she cares about you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I could feel that. It was just amazing to watch that transfer.
I want to add to that. I've been asked by people who've read the book, like, is this a kumbaya story? Is this one of those kind of, there's a term called magic Negro. Is this kind of story where the black person exists to make white people feel better about their racism? Am I implying that if we just hug white people, racism will disappear? And I'm like, no. As you probably know, reading the book, I talk a lot about systemic racism and all that. But what I'm trying to say is that if we only tell stories that either imply or say that racism is a permanent part of in America, that racism can't be eradicated or transcended in white American, what incentive do they have to change? If we only tell these hopeless stories about racism, how do we go forward in this country? I tell people, we used to sing, "We shall overcome." Now, we don't think we can overcome this stuff. And I think it's good, it's necessary to tell stories that show people we can get past this. We can get past racism. And I don't know if a lot of people believe that now, but that has been my experience. To see Aunt Mary change the way she did and see other members of my family change the way they did, I never would have expected that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, talking about racism, let's talk about your maternal grandfather, Mr. Bill Daly.
Yeah.
So can you share the story of the first time your father went to visit your mom and met your grandfather?
Yeah, it was a story I heard a lot. So my father met my mom in 63 in Baltimore. And this is several years before the Supreme Court even said in 67 that interracial marriage was constitutional. So this is a really tense time where you could get killed as a Black man. And he tried to catch a cab to go over to my mom's white neighborhood. Cab driver initially wouldn't even take him there. That's how perilous this just trek was. But he goes there, he knocks on the door, and instead of my mom answering the door, her father answers the door. And he attacks my father, physically attacks him, calls the N-word, and has him arrested by the police. So he was the guy who hated my father because he's Black. He told the police officer, "This NIGGER is trying to see my daughter." I never met him. I never knew him. Those are the stories I heard about him. And I never met him because when he was alive, he didn't want to meet me. So he was somebody that was like a prime example of a racist white man to me.
Yeah. Now, you carried a lot of anger and hatred towards this guy, obviously, for a very long time. And in the book, you mentioned actually being visited by a spirit and being haunted by him. And you were puzzled by this, and you decided to ask your father-in-law for some advice on what to do about your grandfather's visitations. Can you tell us what your father-in-law suggested to you?
Yeah, so some context for a listener. This is a very strange and unusual part of the story that I suspect a lot of people will find hard to believe, and I don't blame them because I find it hard to believe, and I've experienced it with other people with me at the same time when I was experiencing it, who also saw what I saw. But the context is when I was a young man, my younger brother and I, we were awakened one night and we saw this elderly white man in our bedroom. And he wasn't he was a presence, but it wasn't quite physical, but we could clearly see him. And he was doing certain things in our bedroom, ignoring us. And we were terrified. We didn't know what to do. But I put that incident behind me. And as I got older, I tried not to think about it because what do you do with something like that? Got married, and my wife knew nothing about this. And so one morning I awakened and she was terrified. And I'm like, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I was awakened last night and there was this white man standing over the bed looking at you with this troubled expression on his face." And I showed her a picture of my maternal grandfather. And I said, "Is this the man?" And she said, "Yes." "Who is he?" And I had to tell her the story. And this happened again with her. So he kept on wanting something from me. So I had to figure out what he wanted and what to do about it. And not to, and just to deal with how incredibly wild the situation was. And so what I did is I called my mother, my wife's father, who was a minister. And I felt like he knew about things like this. And we talked, and he gave me very specific advice on what I could do to reach out to my grandfather, who seemed to be reaching out to me, wanted to say something. And that's part of the story as well.
Mm. And so,
did you think that was wild when you were reading? Did you like, "Oh, he's making this up"? I'm curious.
No, as I listened to it, it felt real to me.
Yeah, it was real as hell. I'm telling you. You never want to go through that. It's terrifying because it telling you, Michael, it was like when I awakened as a kid, I didn't know why, but my body was frozen. I was covered in sweat. I knew something was wrong. I was terrified, but I didn't quite know in my mind what was wrong. I have never had that kind of fear before when you just wake up terrified. It was, and I mean, I've had guns pointed at me. I've been in a situation I thought I was going to die, but nothing like this. It was real as hell. And I tell people, people say, oh, there's no such thing as stuff like apparitions and all that. And I say, I envy you if you believe that, because you'll probably never experience it. Because if you do experience it, you will never forget it.
Yeah. And again, as I listened to you share that story, it was very real for me. I didn't in any way get this sense that you were just making it up. It felt real to me. So, but with that being said, we moved to the part about forgiveness.
Yeah.
And part of the suggestion I think your father-in-law made was for you to, I think he asked you if you had gone to his grave or something, his gravesite or something.
Yeah. 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 He did. So there's a belief, and I've read about this, that apparitions or ghosts, whatever you want to call them, that they often come back because there's something unresolved. And so what I had to figure out, what was unresolved, what did my grandfather want from me? And part of what I felt like he wanted was forgiveness. And so I did certain things to show him that I forgave him. But before I could forgive him, I had to know him. So what I did at that point is I began to really talk to people who knew him to get the portrait of what kind of man he was. And one of the interesting things I found out about him, and this is something that has shaped my view about racism, is that you can't define people by their worst act. Yes, he was clearly captured by racism. What he did was awful to my father, to not be in my life. But that's not all he was, I discovered. He had other qualities to him that were good. And in fact, a weird thing is that just before he died, the last person he called was a Black man who was one of his best friends. So he was a complex person, and I had to learn these things about him and to see him really as a human being and not just as a monster. And that has kind of guided my views toward, dealing with racism and white people. Yes, you have to call it out, but people are complex. Sometimes that's not all who they are. They have other sides to it. I say in a book, I used to think that you were a racist or you're not, and there's no in between. But there are a lot of in-betweens when it comes to human nature. We all have these different sides to us. And my grandfather really taught me that.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, there are some people who suggest, collectively speaking, that, Black people are just too forgiving when you look at all the injustices we've endured. But
Yeah.
I believe the only way to heal the world is through forgiveness. And forgiveness is never really about the other people. It's really about releasing any negative feelings of resentment I may be holding on to about that person so that I become free, even when they've hurt us. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts about forgiveness?
What you said, I think, was very eloquent. I talk clearly about my Christian faith in the book. And I think forgiveness is very pragmatic and very practical. It feels good. It's liberating to get this anger off you. What I was taught is that when you hate somebody, you have allowed them to control you. When you have this continual anger and hate, we all been in these situations where somebody at work or somebody we know that just annoys us, we can't stand them. And what happens? We're thinking about them all the time. And when you forgive, to me, they're not in your mind all the time. You're able to get it out and you're able to see them as a human being. And I think it's also, for me, it's also a necessity, because one of the things I said in the book, when I begin to see my Aunt Mary in a different way, I begin to see, yeah, she had done things that were clearly racist. But I began to realize that I had also grown up in this environment where I hated like all white people. And it was a really racially segregated environment that was similar to her. And I said, what was in her was also in me. So what I also try to say with forgiveness is also acknowledging something that, when people do awful things, that we are also capable of the same thing in ourselves. And that's a good thing to know. It provides humility. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think sometimes people see forgiveness and they think it means that we don't think we should be angry, that we should just accept things as they are. And clearly in my book, you see me confronting my aunt. You see me confronting my anger and dealing with this stuff. I don't think that, I mean, you can do that and still forgive.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I from a spiritual perspective, how I see it is that when I'm holding on, because we cannot go through life without being victimized in some way, right?
Right.
But we get to choose whether we remain victims by those things that hurt us. And I have experienced every imaginable type of racism you could imagine. As you mentioned, I had a white guy put a gun to my head because I was black. You know, I dated a white girl in high school, and her father called me up one night and said he was going to kill me rather than have his daughter date a black guy. So I know what that's like. But what I have come to know and believe is that it's really about me processing internally that which hurt me and then deciding what I'm going to do with that hurt. And forgiveness is letting go of that hurt, whatever that hurt might be. And I know that, as you mentioned, you can give lectures on race relations. You can, talk about it politically, but it's really about the heart. It's really about us as human beings getting to a place where we can open our hearts to each other and recognize that we're human beings. We're all the same. But I know that as a man who happens to be black, I have been attacked and criticized and vilified because I believe it's possible to heal racism.
You've been attacked for that?
I'm sorry?
You've been criticized for that belief?
All my life. All my
What,
life.
why do people...
I've been criticized because from a black perspective, because of my optimistic outlook, it's like I'm denying that racism exists. I'm denying institutionalized racism, which in reality I'm definitely not. It's just I choose to focus my attention on how I'm interacting with the things that are happening outside of me. So for me, what I'm saying is, I believe transformation begins with the heart. And you mentioned it's all about relationships. And I have been fortunate enough to have been exposed to a lot of white people who were just as loving and caring and compassionate as anybody else. I've also had, being brought up in the inner city projects of Corpus Christi, Texas, knowing how people in my community held this idea, this belief that, all white people were bad and you couldn't trust them. And so I've had both sides of it, but I simply choose now to accept and believe that I can, first of all, only heal myself. And in healing myself and how I approach others, that's how we heal the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad to me because I can relate a little bit. I think people think some of my story is just implying, like I said before, that racism is all about personal feelings. And I do know it's also about power. I'm a big fan of Frederick Douglass, who said, power can seize nothing without the man. It never has and it never will. So I believe, for example, that we got to agitate for voting rights, for getting rid of the mass incarceration, blah, 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 all those issues. And you can Google me. I've written with passion about that. But all I'm trying to say in my story is that I think we also have to realize that these interracial relationships and creating these interracial communities is also an indispensable tool in fighting racism. And I think we've forgotten it. So that should be part of the toolkit. And I think lately, in the past couple of years, people don't feel like personal relationships are trying to find common ground or trying to forgive. They feel like that has nothing, that has no value whatsoever. And I think it's a huge mistake.
And I agree 100%. Again, I so resonate with the message in your book, your philosophy on race. Again, it's like we're kindred spirits in a lot of ways. And that was one of the reasons why I want to have you on the show. But as mentioned, I think it's important for us, especially as Black men, to have these conversations, period.
Yeah.
Just to talk about what is it that's driving our anger or hatred toward white people or vice versa. How can we resolve the racial challenges within our society and our community. So again, I think your book is an excellent opportunity for us, especially as Black men, to dive into that question, about race. And I think you did a wonderful job of sharing your story, but also, again, filling me with hope and
Well,
optimism.
thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.
So with that being said, as we wind down, it's now the 10 o'clock hour. I just want to now give you an opportunity just to share with the audience your final thoughts. Again, I love the book. Let me put this out there first. First of all, I love this book. I really do. So now, John, I just want to give you an opportunity, just your final thoughts on whatever.
Well, it's hard for me to express myself because stories kind of explain themselves better. But I will just try to kind of restate a point I tried to make earlier, and that is that I do feel like we're at this critical point in our country's history where a lot of people have kind of given up on believing that we can have any kind of future where we can get past our racial divisions. And I think for us to deal with that kind of pessimism, we have to become better storytellers. And I think my story shows that kind of hope. My mom and dad were very courageous people. And like I said, I look around and I think about how accepted and normal interracial relationships are now, biracial kids are now. And I ask myself, how did that happen? And it didn't happen because the Supreme Court decided. It didn't happen because politicians. It first happened because ordinary people like my mom and dad, who seemed to have no power, acted in their lives. And when others like them acted in the same way, it created a ripple effect and it created this new norm. So I tell people, like, again, I'm living proof that people who seem like they have no power can really remake America. So we have to be optimistic, and if people can change, the country can change. So a lot of people don't even know it, but, the whole idea of race and racism is just a recent invention. So, it's not like this has been around for centuries. So, yeah, that's what I hope people get from my story, that they don't give up on one another. They don't give up on this country.
Yeah. And I definitely, again, I want to acknowledge you for the courage to put it out there, for you to share your story. Because again, it starts with conversations, and this book is I think a great conversation starter to engage us in this conversation about race in a way that's not divisive and separating us. Yeah. Again, that's what I loved about the book. So again, thank you, John, for spending an hour with us, man. I really, really appreciate you. Thank you for shattering the stereotypes of what it means to be a Black man in America. I love your perspective, and I look forward to what's next. As a matter of fact, what is next? You have any ideas about a new book?
Oh, no, that's the last thing I'm thinking about right now. I just want to, I did that while working full time. I just want to rest. So no, nothing, no plans for a new book right now.
All right. So if someone wants to learn more about your writings and stuff, how would they find you?
Well, I have a website. I think it's johnkblake.com. You can easily reach me, I'm on Twitter and Facebook. I'm very accessible. So, yeah. And
so I'll have a link below this video for people to find you. Which link would you like me to place below the video? Which
I think it's my website. I think it's johnkblake.com.
Got it. I will definitely put it there. All right, my man. So again, thank you for sharing an hour with us on Shatter the Stereotypes. And for the audience, again, I highly recommend this book because this is what this show is about. It's about us as Black men coming together, sharing these stories, and having a space that we can speak openly and honestly about what we deal with on a daily basis. And again, I love, John, how you say hope. We have to have hope. we have to have hope. And again, I'm an optimist. And I personally believe that as Black men, we are capable of being, doing, and having anything we set our minds to. And it all starts here. So again,
thank you.
Thanks for sharing this episode with us, John, and we'll see you next episode.
Thank you, Michael. Okay.